Hey guys, tonight I'm going to be recording a little bit of Modern in anticipation of Grand Prix Minneapolis, which is coming up in a little bit over 2 weeks. I won't personally be going, but I'm betting a lot of people who want to watch videos of formats right now will. Um, that's coming up. The Modern PTQ season is, I think, coming up right after the sealed one, which I don't know the schedule exactly, but should be ending relatively soon. Um, and I kind of figured I'd start with, it looks to me at least, to be the sort of default deck of the format. There's a lot of talk about Melirapod, obviously, and the deck's very good. But this deck is pretty well positioned against Melirapod and is kind of touted by quite a few people who have been. Uh, I don't want to know. I don't want to say experts. The kind of people who, you have Patrick Dickman, who's been touting this RUGTwin deck, and he's kind of a format or like an archetype expert, and this is like his best build. Then you have someone like Brad Nelson, who has, come to be or has kind of proven himself as a event by event format expert, and this is where he ended up. And him and Todd really sort of pushed this deck after Richmond, from what I saw. So I figure this is a good place to start, especially because it's relatively new compared to Melirapod. The list is just the list that Todd played at the GP, but I don't want to talk about why this deck works, why I like this version, why I don't like previous versions of this deck, and go from there. So, the previous version of Dickman's deck was his straight blue-red list, which had Snapcasters, I think it was like four twins, a Kiki Jiki, if I remember correctly, and it had a bunch of Pestermites. I hated that deck. Um, and that was because I didn't feel like it could actually win games with its Plan B. But this deck feels a lot different. This deck feels like with the way the so modern right now is kind of reminiscent of vintage. I've been playing a fair amount of that format lately, and there's a lot of parallels. And you have two kind of categories of things. You have slightly more expensive things that are very very powerful, things that require multiple cards like Splinter Twin Deceiver Exarch or Voltaic Key Time Vault. Things that are a little more costly but very dominant effects that don't maybe immediately end the game. The vintage example would be Jace the Mind Sculptor. The modern example might be, um, I guess, Birthing Pod's a pretty reasonable example, as well as I'm trying to think of other similar scale things. But you end up the format branches into two kind of paths. You have the decks that are really, really focused on creating one very powerful effect. So in modern, you can see like all in Splinter Twin decks, the pod decks. There's a lot of decks that have this sort of ad nauseum storm where they're very dedicated because they can be because there's the tools to create those powerful effects. Then you have the decks that do something powerful but spread their interaction or power a little bit down the curve to things that are a little lower impact on the immediate game state. So Tarmogoyf is a good threat, but it's not as high impact as, say, making a million creatures or birthing potting. It's not going to dominate a game in the exact same way. But what it has going for it is that in both, there's a lot of cards that just answer things in this format. There's Lightning Bolt, there's Path to Exile, there's Mana Leak, Thought Seize, things like that. And if you're more expensive cards, you have to put a lot more into them. So when they get answered, you lose a lot more. Whereas when you like throw out a Tarmogoyf and it dies, you're like, oh well, I lost a Tarmogoyf for their probably 2 mana card. That's great. You're not really very far behind in that exchange. Um, what ends up happening a lot is that you exchange these slightly less powerful cards for their answers that would normally cover your powerful effects, and as a result, you can win the games where they don't where they waste all their stuff answering your less powerful cards just by killing them with your actually game-ending effect. Or if this card resolves, you're probably going to win with it. Um, this was actually kind of the shell of the best standard deck I've ever played, which was the Deceiver Exarch Splinter Twin Stoneforge Mystic deck. And that's the other parallel I want to draw to this deck that I really like is that I think Tarmogoyf as a 2 mana threat is one of the really huge upgrades to this archetype. Um, just the ability to have a cheap threat that lets you play with all your other interaction, all that stuff, that ends the game on its own. That sort of parallel between this and what Stormforge Mystic represented with Batterskull in Standard um, is one of the big reasons I'm excited about this exact list. Is that you actually have something that uh, it's a creature good enough to have a disruptive shell around it. It's not like a Pestermite where you're like, why am I trying to kill them with a 2/1? Um, this card might get in some chip shots, but realistically, if you tap their blocker, get in damage with Tarmogoyf and hit them once with it, probably good enough. You don't need it to connect for the full, 14 or whatever damage. So that's my spiel on this deck. Um, Looking at the sideboard, I also am pretty happy with how the sideboard's constructed. You'll notice there's a lot of powerful effects in the sideboard, which is really important in this format. You can't kind of mess around with effects that are just okay against things. Threads is absurdly good against things like Dark Confidant, Tarmogoyf, and Zoo, just as a 2-for-1 answer that against things like Goyf and Bob, you're going to beat them with them if they don't answer it and create the 2-for-1 situation. Anger is actually, I'm willing to say it's probably the most influential card from the latest block in the format. It's a sweeper that handles a lot of the cards that have been traditionally hard to kill in this format, um, such as Voice of Resurgence and Kitchen Finks. Like if you're trying to grind someone out, that was how Pod always beat those decks. Was that you just have a 2-for-1 and then another 2-for-1, and even if your opponent's deck was all like Electrolyzes and Lightning Bolts, they'd eventually just run out and lose. We have our counter suite, which against the decks that counterspells are good. All these cards are very, very effective. They're just split this way to kind of maximize your deck in a lot of different scenarios. Like, for example, you don't need to have all your counterspells be good against blue, white, red, but it's good to have some that are. So, like, Negate is pretty good against blue, white, red. Counterflux is good against specific other combo decks like Scape Shift, where you want to counter their kill card and have them not counter back. Also, Twin Mirrors. And in the matchups where you want a bunch of counterspells like Storm, all of these are pretty much interchangeable. You're going to dispel their ritual. You're going to negate whatever. You're going to counterflux whatever. You're going to Vindicate Click whatever. That's fine. It'll do its work. Let's see. We have Explosives as the third anger. That's a bit of a concession to Affinity in my mind, because Explosives kills a lot of the Affinity cards that anger might not. Like a 4/4 Archon Ravager doesn't die. Explosives can take out a Mox Opal and sweep some random things in the low end. It can also kill Cranial Plating. Thrun is just kind of our big threat. I actually have not been a huge fan of Thrun in this format, just because it kind of faltered against a lot of the Jund threats. But with Jund falling out of the format a little bit, and also being a little less able to um, aggressively play some of its threats into a Thrun due to Deathray Shaman being gone, like it's a little harder for them to stick a Tarmogoyf at a good spot early on, especially against the Splinter Twin deck. And it's a little harder for them to necessarily land a Liliana at the right time. Not much. So it might be better, but I'm kind of hesitant to board it in there. It's really just an all-star against the blue control decks. We have our standard Affinity Hate, which is kind of necessary because that deck is real good. Vandal Blast is there for mana flexibility. You don't necessarily overload it, but you can. Spellskite as a mirror breaker that also kind of hedges against removal heavy decks. And Sword as just another threat, similar to Thrun. This card is going to be good against Jund, obviously because of the protection, but also against matchups where they're going to be playing a lot of random like green or black blockers, like potentially. I'm trying to think. Like there's a lot of non-Jund mid-range decks that could surface that this would be good against. That might have different threat bases. I know at the Pro Tour, there was talk of Doran decks that this card would have been great against. So I'm not so sure on it against Pod, but it's probably good against the rest of the field. So this is the deck I'm going to be playing. We'll see how it goes. We'll see what we can learn about it. From what I understand, this is one of the more intricate decks in the format. So we'll hopefully have a lot of decision points to talk about.